Tonight we're starting our last and final unit of the course. That's Unit 8, which focuses on JavaScript. And JavaScript is one of those three key technologies of the web. There's HTML, there's CSS, and there's JavaScript. And all three of those are considered absolutely essential for web development. If there's only three technologies you learn, those are the three, because those will get you most of the way there on a lot of projects. Now, if you look here in Chapter 8, we are also going to be switching textbooks. We're finishing the last chapter of our HTML book, which talks about JavaScript, but it does it in a very brief fashion. It's kind of an overview more than really teaching you the technology. And then we're going to be moving into the JavaScript text. And the thing I was pointing out here in class is I noticed that my syllabus listed the 5th edition of the book as the textbook, when in reality it should be the 6th edition. So if you purchase the 5th edition, that's not a problem. I do have a PDF version of the 6th edition here that you can refer to do the homework. So I'm going to expect you to do the homework from the 6th edition. I have all the resource files and all the stuff that comes with it. All that stuff is available on the resources page. So if you go digging here for it, you can see right here the JavaScript data files. There's PowerPoints and errata. You should always check the errata whenever you're working in any textbook. And I will be adding the PowerPoints for these chapters by next week, unless we actually get to it tonight. If we get to the point where we can work on it tonight, that would be great, but I'm not counting on that fact. All right, so going back to Unit 8, which is not showing up on the sidebar, is it? I'll show you guys the magic of fixing it. Yep, and now the link is there. You should be able to see it. But just a reminder again, the 6th edition textbook PDF is right here. That really should not be an excuse for not buying the book. You should still buy the book because you'll need it for the dynamic elements class. And it frankly, it's a very well written JavaScript book. We've tried a lot of different ones, and this author is really good, and the exercises are really good. They're sort of in a tutorial format, meaning they're guided, so you're not just writing code from scratch. And that when you're learning a new language, it's actually not a bad thing. Now you guys have had some amount of programming under your belts, I'm hoping. Maybe intro to programming. If you're in program sequence, you should be taking that course concurrently with this one. If you haven't had any programming yet, you're going to be learning some programming concepts too. So, and you'll see a little bit of overlap. You're going to learn about things like variables and if statements and arrays and things like that. And if you have no clue what that is, you definitely want to read your book real carefully. If you have had programming before, and it doesn't matter really what language it is, if it's Java or C# or whatever you've learned, a lot of the concepts transfer to JavaScript. But one thing you're going to discover about JavaScript is JavaScript in and of itself is not a programming language in the traditional sense of a programming language. A programming language, you write code, it compiles, it turns into binary code that the machine can operate, that stands alone from a piece of software. It becomes its own piece of software. It is compiled code. JavaScript, on the other hand, is executed code. It's not compiled, it just runs. And it runs within a browser. And that's a very different paradigm than if you've, let's say, learned how to do Java programming, where you have to like debug and compile for the program to run. With JavaScript, if you've got a browser, you can run it, as long as your code's right. You can debug it, and it can be used for other things as well. And you're going to see, you know, as you go through this program, why JavaScript is arguably, you know, one of the most important languages you'll learn. There was a time when people thought it would be replaced by other technologies, but the truth is it's become more and more important in the last few years, partially because of its flexibility. It works on every device, every browser, every operating system. It works. and it doesn't have the overhead of a lot of other languages. So it's I've heard it be called basically the glue that holds the internet together. So how true that is, we'll see. All right, so go ahead and open up your PowerPoint if you're following along. And as I warned the class here, if it's helpful for you, I recommend getting an editor open of some sort. I'm just going to use Notepad++ tonight. And of course, I have a browser open already. And not that we're going to do a lot of coding while we do the PowerPoint, but we will do some, just so you get a feel for how it works and show you some of the tools that you're going to be using. Really, you know, any text editor will work, and that's just the same as doing web stuff. Also, any browser will work for testing your code. So that's pretty handy stuff to know. All right, here's the outcomes for the chapter. Pretty simplistic. And I am going to be jumping to external resources as we work. So it's not just going to be slide by slide. We're going to kind of be jumping all over the place. So hopefully you take some copious notes. All right, so let's answer the million-dollar question. What actually is JavaScript? And this is kind of important. And you may have not yet learned formally what object-oriented programming is. Or maybe you've heard about it and you don't really understand what it means. And actually, you may have learned about it and you still don't understand what it means. And that does happen because, you know, when you're working with objects in a programming language, it's kind of like a conceptual leap that happens when you understand that there's classes and objects, and knowing that JavaScript is really an object-based language. Basically, everything inside the language is object-oriented, even though we can't really do formal object-oriented programming like you would in Java. But you can manipulate the language to have it behave like an object-oriented language, and that's another thing that you'll eventually learn. All right, so the way that it operates is it works hand in hand with the browser and the documents that you're working with. And the browser, its windows, the tabs, all the elements, even the history, those are all considered objects to JavaScript. Things within the document, the HTML tags, the paragraph tags, you know, any tag that you have, those are all considered objects as well. And because everything's considered an object, you can directly address it and manipulate it. And you can use a number of different approaches to do that. So this is what they're basically showing you here, is that you have the window, you know, the whole program that runs it, the page that holds it, and all the little components of the page. It's all part of it, and that's all of what JavaScript can control. So where does it come from? Well, it was developed with Netscape, and that happened pretty early on, because having pages that just sit there are pretty boring. I mean, it's akin to looking at a piece of paper. Okay, granted, it's cool that you can click on something and you can go somewhere else. And that, without JavaScript, it's kind of what you're limited to, just seeing things on the screen. Nothing necessarily really happens on its own. So they came up with a scripting language, and they originally called it LiveScript. And for whatever reason, you know, at some point, other people got into the game and started creating similar versions, because they were also working on browsers, Microsoft very much so. And they started coming up with different names, and you know, formally it's actually called ECMA script still. I mean, that's the actual real name for it. But at some point, I'm not sure if it was Netscape or, you know, Sun Microsystems, they decided that, well, why don't you just call it JavaScript? Java is really popular as a programming language, and at the time it really was. But ever since that point, it has been a confusing thing for a lot of people, even people that are in the field. Oh, I learned my Java and I put it on my web page. Well, yeah, you can actually put Java on a web page, but really what you're talking about is JavaScript. So don't make the confusion that Java is JavaScript or JavaScript is Java, because it's not. They do share some commonalities syntactically, you use curly braces and semicolons, and some of the naming conventions and the logic statements are similar. So that's what part of why we have a little bit of confusion about it. But the plus side of it is the syntax that you learn also transfers well to other languages. Now, those of you that are doing Intro to Programming, and most likely you're learning Intro to Programming with Visual Basic, right? And Visual Basic really is truly an oddball language. It is really not like any other language. It is based upon BASIC, and BASIC was one of the original languages that helped us to develop the DOS operating system and then Windows. And up until maybe a decade or so ago, it was the primary language that Microsoft used to develop Windows and all of its applications. At some point, though, they were discovering some limitations with the language that, basically on the object-oriented class structure stuff, that forced them to come up with a variant of the C language called C#. And those of you that will be moving forward in the program, when we do like Web 2, we do ASP.NET, we do any of the SharePoint stuff, it's all in C#. And that was a conscious choice this past summer that we made that switch, because that's what Microsoft teaches in all of their programs. They don't teach VB. So if Microsoft's not teaching it, why should we be teaching it? So if you've taken Intro to Programming with VB, don't panic. The skills still all transfer. It's just now you have to use semicolons and curly brackets with all your stuff, where in VB you don't have to do that. C#. Okay. C# is a separate language from C++, but it's very C++-like, and very C-like, and very Java-like. It's just Microsoft's take on it. And in fact, when you work with C#, you'll see that there's some commonalities between Visual Basic and C#, because they use some of the same libraries, basically. All right, so Java is not JavaScript and vice versa. Please remember that. All right, what do we use it for? Here's some examples of things that we use it for. Usually if you see something on a web page that's like moving or reacting or doing something, as simple as really, like operating your email. So for example, I'm going to bring up my gateway email. Hopefully nobody has anything too sensitive in here to look at. But let's say like I click on an email message. I don't know if you guys are noticing, but when I clicked on that message, just this part of the screen changed, right? What really actuates a lot of the stuff that we see and a lot of the Google stuff through a browser happens through a combination of JavaScript and jQuery and a number of other different JavaScript libraries that people use. And what it allows us to do is create applications within the browser that mimic the behavior of a traditional application within a regular windowed operating system. So that's kind of been a move really since web pages were developed, because when you think about, let's say, running a program like this within Windows, you click the icon, it runs, you can do whatever you do with it, you can save, you can do all this stuff, but that's operating natively within the operating system. In a browser, you're just kind of getting a snapshot of stuff that's on a server somewhere. But the goal is that the browser, and we've reached that point now, frankly, that this has become the main delivery platform for applications. And it's only going to increase. So for example, like Microsoft Office always used to be a thing that we would buy, sometimes on disks, or download, and then install. And you can still do that. But I don't know if you're aware, if you go to office.com, have you guys ever done this? Right? You just sign in, and you have the whole Office suite right there. It's in the browser. You're not downloading it. A lot of the way that Microsoft makes that work is through JavaScript. I mean, clearly there's more going on in the background, but it pushes to the browser now. You don't have to even install it on your machine. The amount of disk space it saves, the processing power it saves, I mean, it's a very cool thing. So if you haven't tried that, you get it for free through Gateway, so you may as well use it. And just a FYI, if you use Office 365 through Gateway, you can install it on up to 5 machines too. And you don't have to pay. Did I mention that? My favorite price. All right, so browsers have become an application delivery platform, and that's one of the reasons why JavaScript has become so important. So let's take a look at some of the stuff they have listed here. It says display a message box. So you go to a website and a little box pops up. We usually close them right away, but those are often done with JavaScript. You can pull things down in navigation. You can validate form information, create windows, rollover, status messages, display current date, do calculations. A lot of the same kind of stuff that you can do with a regular programming language. The difference is it happens within the browser. All right. In JavaScript, when you do code, you will be coding initially by putting stuff directly onto an HTML page. Same way we did CSS. Okay, so we'll basically create script tags on the page, and in between the script tags, we will put our JavaScript code. It allows us basically to insert a different language into our HTML documents. So why don't we actually experiment with that a little bit. Let's just go ahead and create a new document. Let's see if you guys can do this faster than me. You guys should be getting pretty fast at this now, right? Or maybe you got smart and listened to my advice and created a template file that you just opened up, did a save as, and you're all done. It's not bad to practice your skills, though. All right, so I have a basic document here, and I'm just going to create a couple of little things on the page to start with. Let's just do an H1, just to have something on the page. And let's create a paragraph. And then let's save it, and let's find a pertinent spot. And I just created a Unit 8 folder, and then I'm just going to give this, I mean, it can be index.html. It doesn't really matter, frankly. It's the only file I have right now in there. So we have our doc type up at the top, HTML opening and closing, head opening and closing, a title tag, body tag, a H1, and a paragraph. And hopefully you guys can all see that just fine. All right, so we're going to do a really simple little example here, and we're going to basically go on to the next slide so you can see what it is. But we can take the JavaScript code and do as I said. We can create a script tag. Once again, we're going to open and close it. And kind of like we did with, the style tag, do you guys remember that? One option is you can also add type equals you can do that. And up until HTML5, you had to do that. It was required. You can summarily dismiss that now. If you want to leave it in, go for it. If your software does it automatically, that's wonderful. Just leave it there. I'm just telling you, you don't need it. Okay. All right, so you have your script tags, and then inside the script tags is where you put your JavaScript code. Now, the interesting thing is, if you notice that I'm putting the JavaScript script tags inside the head section of the document. I can also move it down here. Okay, so it can be in line with the HTML, very much like CSS. It can be in the head section, which is what we call embedded, and then it can also be an external file that we link to. All three approaches work. The preference is that it's an external file. There are some circumstances, though, where it has to be on the page. And there's circumstances that will dictate when you put the script at the bottom of the page, or the top of the page, or in the middle of the page, or an external file. But generally speaking, you should be able to accomplish almost everything you want to do by putting it in an external file, and ultimately, that is what you'll be pushed to do. It's just good practice, and it really adheres to the whole semantic web concept of HTML for content and structure, CSS for style, JavaScript for behavior, basically. So if you remember those little precepts, you'll be fine. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here, and you can see they have a little bit of a script here for us. And really the part that we're going to be dropping in is just this little snippet of code. So I'm just going to drop that in between. And it's not that I'm ignoring the rest of it, but I want to give you a little bit of a background as to what's happening. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're just going to save it. And you can see the script has a command that says alert, parentheses, and then some double quotes, welcome to our site. And then notice that the statement is closed with a semicolon. JavaScript is kind of an odd language. You can actually write a JavaScript statement and omit the semicolon, and it works. However, it's not considered good practice. The good practice is that you always put the semicolon in when a statement is complete. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and actually run this. So I'm going to bring it up in my browser, and we'll just bring it up in Chrome. You see what it did? It just brings up what they call an alert box. Of course, where's my H1 in my paragraph? Well, I got to click OK first, and then I'll see them. Let's compare that with taking the script tag and putting it in the body below the H1 in the paragraph tag. Save your work, and then do the same thing again. Launch it. Yes, it worked the same, didn't it? The alert box basically overrides what's happening on the page. So this is really a pretty simplistic implementation. Now remember that the script tag, as they show in the PowerPoint, you can always have that extra little snippet of attribute in there which says type equals text/JavaScript. And I know some instructors will insist that you have to put it in there. Okay. The truth is you really don't have to put it in there. Shh. If it was a type of script that was something other than JavaScript, then you would specify. But JavaScript is the default scripting language for a browser. Now the other thing that's kind of odd is this. Do you guys recognize these? What are those? Comments. So why on earth would somebody bother to do this? Because I don't know if you're noticing, because even though I put comment tags in here, it's not commenting that out. And then additionally, they have this other weird thing where they go like this. So this is how you do a comment in JavaScript if it's the beginning of a line. You can do this in CSS too, by the way, and most programming languages, so that everything after those two slashes is ignored. Now, this comment mark is so that JavaScript will ignore it. The other ones are so that HTML will ignore it. You got that? So here's the funny thing. In the old days, we would have browsers that wouldn't necessarily be able to read the JavaScript. So you would have to comment it out so that it didn't trigger errors in your code. This also, I can say, you can summarily dismiss these days, but a good textbook like ours will show you that formally you should probably have it there. If you look at people's code, nobody uses it. What's that? Well, you're commenting it out so that it doesn't read as HTML. Well, it would appear as text. I know it's kind of an odd thing to explain, but what I'm trying to tell you is that if you just do it like this, it'll work just fine. Where you might run into problems if you happen to be running like Windows 98 with Internet Explorer 5, you might have some issues. But that's not the case, right? Yeah, very much so. Let's not knock it. It was a good operating system for its time. All right, so some questions there. All right, so one thing that we're going to explore now is something they call the DOM. And that stands for, obviously, the Document Object Model. And this is basically a hierarchy of all the objects that JavaScript can address and manipulate. So if you notice, it starts at the top level with the window. So the browser window itself is the top level of the DOM. From there, you start addressing other aspects of the browser. One is the document in the window. The other is the history. You can actually manipulate the history. Have you guys ever gone to a website and you click the back button and it doesn't take you back?
Yeah.
All right, stop looking at porn, would you? I'm kidding. It's a technique that some people use to keep people on a site, but that's done through the manipulation of history. But it also allows you actually that you can write JavaScript code that will take you back 3 steps, or actually look for an item in your history. So that's kind of interesting. Location is basically the address of whatever you're looking at. So you can actually, via JavaScript, change the location of the browser window. So I can say, I'm here now, but now I want to go there. And you can use JavaScript to trigger you to go somewhere else. And then there's the navigator, which is basically the browser engine itself and the component that runs the machine. There's basically, you can actually probe that. And I don't want it to sound too weird, but basically what you can do is you can run a piece of script that will check to see what browser is this person running. And that can be very pertinent because you can write JavaScript code that will return, oh, you're running Internet Explorer. So we're going to give you this other CSS just because you're running Internet Explorer. That's not uncommon. And then you can also see that you can also see the name of the application, the browser, the version, and in some cases you can pull back additional information with the JavaScript, including IP address, operating system, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of different things that go with that. So coming over back to the far left end of this, and you can see when we go to the document, and this is usually how we use the DOM. We don't usually think about the upper level things that much. We usually think about the document stuff, especially as we begin. So the document itself, and then you can see there's anchor tags and a form, and inside the form there's form elements, and there's an image, right? And the image has a source. So we not only can address the image, which is the tag, but we can address the attribute of the tag as well. So you start to see the power of that. And because we can address those things, we can change them. We can create them, destroy them, change what they are. We can do all sorts of really interesting things. It's really kind of like what your imagination sees as a limit, basically. All right, and I think this is a fascinating thing to know because it's really part of what unlocks the power of JavaScript. So let's go ahead and go to the browser where we were just looking at the pages that we created. And I mean, this is the result of loading the document. Of course, you guys are probably already familiar with the fact that you can do view page source, and you can see the code. Notice, JavaScript is not hidden. JavaScript is visible just like CSS is visible. Now the thing that's a little bit more interesting is if you go back to this view, the regular view of the page, and do the right-click inspect, and I know a lot of you have explored this tool already, this really helps you both understand the DOM and also shows you some powerful tools that are available that you might not know about. And I know that we've looked at it a little bit, and some of you kind of have discovered this on your own from your readings or whatever, or other people have shown you. But this is, you're going to become intimately acquainted with these tools as you go through the web program. You have to be, because there's some of the key troubleshooting tools that you have available. All right, on the left-hand side here, you'll see that there's a bunch of different, basically, tabs for the Inspect Element tool. You'll see, and I'm going to do a little zoom here so it comes out better in the video, what looks sort of like the document structure. Actually, it is a document structure, but it really is arranged in the hierarchy. And we're looking at the elements of the document. Okay, so really what we're doing in terms of this PowerPoint is we're here, and we can look at all the stuff that's inside of it. Not only can we look at all the stuff that's inside of it, we can really tunnel down pretty deep by using these little expander arrows here. And then watch what happens as I hover over any of the elements. Oh wait, nothing happens. But wait, when I get to the body, the visible part of the page, it starts to highlight all the components. So for example, if I want to look at the body, that's the whole body. If I want to look at the H1, there's the H1. And notice as you're looking, a little black pop-up box that comes up there that shows you which tag you're looking at, the pixels it occupies on the screen, etc. Additionally, if I click on it, you'll also see all the CSS that is pulled up. Now, you guys know I didn't write any CSS, right? So then why the heck is there CSS here? Well, the user agent style sheet. The browser has its own style sheet. So what it's doing is, by default, it is showing you what's going on. So what styles it's applying. The ones that we might apply would appear in this section. And if you're not already aware of this, you can actually do what I just did and click here and actually type, type in a style, and guess what it does? Did you see that? And then you can turn it on and off. And not only that, but you're not only limited to what you created, but any of the stuff that's being pulled in. So it's a very handy little tool. But here what we're seeing, and in the hierarchy that you're seeing, is in essence the DOM. It is the document object model in effect. So you're seeing the elements, the space they occupy, and where they're nestled in the hierarchy of the document itself. Any of these things can be directly addressed with JavaScript in a number of different ways. The other interesting thing about JavaScript that you're going to discover is not only can you control the HTML elements and their attributes, but you can also control the CSS for those elements and attributes too. So if that doesn't have your wheels churning, I'm not sure what will. There's so much you can do with it. It's cool. Now the other part that you're going to learn here that's going to be helpful for you is this other tab called Console. Console is geek speak for the command line. And for JavaScript, really what it refers to is the debugger. So if I had an error in my JavaScript code, and I'm just going to go create an error right now so you can see. Like, for example, I'll get rid of the closing parenthesis. And I will save it, and then I will go ahead and run it again. And when it comes up, I'm going to do an inspect element, and I'm going to go to the console, and you see what it does? It tells you that there's something wrong. And not only that, it tells you where it's wrong. Index.html line 7. And if I click on it, it'll take me right to the snippet of code. It's pretty cool, right? If only. Now, as I did that, are you guys also noticing that I went into this other mode now where there's all these other tools that come up? DOM breakpoints, scopes, call stacks, watch, event listeners. And when you get deep into JavaScript and you're learning how to code, all of these tools can be helpful in troubleshooting problems, fixing things, validating what variable values are being held. And if you're used to working with a large, robust IDE like Visual Studio, and you're working with JavaScript, you sometimes miss some of the tools that are available, like debuggers. I don't know if you've noticed that when I click that, we jumped from the console tab over to the sources tab. And that also shows you the hierarchy of the file, like where it's located, and these other tools. You also have the possibility here to pause the execution of the JavaScript, because JavaScript, once a page loads, can continue to run like a regular program does. So you can stop it to help troubleshoot problems. So this is, I think, pretty darn helpful. So with this, you can explore the DOM, your styles, console for errors, and very often when you run into problems with JavaScript, this will be your first line of defense is coming here and see what the debugger says. All right. Let's go back to our PowerPoint. And actually, one more thing I want to say before I proceed. JavaScript is what we call a client-side programming language, scripting language, technically. It operates inside the browser. It will not execute on the server natively. Although there's been a change lately where there are certain versions of JavaScript, like Node.js very notably, that allows you to run JavaScript on a server. And that's kind of, it's not new, but it's relatively new in terms of its popularity and its usage. And one of the reasons why that's happening is because people are so comfortable writing in JavaScript that, well, why can't we make it run on the server too? So that's what they're doing. Because that way you don't have to learn another language like PHP or ASP or Java or. So it gives you some capabilities like server-side languages. But for the most part, it is a client-side language. It needs the browser to operate. Nothing is happening on the server that makes the code execute. It has to come to your machine and the browser will render it. All right, let's talk about what an object is. For example, according to the author, he says, it's a thing or an entity. Well, thank you. I would have never known. But that includes the browser window. It includes any HTML element, like a button. It could be the document itself. So we talked about all those things being objects, and I think we explained that pretty well. We also have properties. And properties are something that we don't often see or think about when we're working with browsers, because really up until this point, you guys haven't really had a reason to worry about any of these things. But there are little properties that go with DOM elements. So for example, the document has a background color, and if any of you know ancient HTML, this is the way that we used to set background colors with like HTML 1 and 2. That's how we did it. And really what we were doing is we were triggering the property of the document, not the code, which is kind of an interesting thing. But there are some things here that you'll notice are very intuitive as to what they mean. Last modified, when was the last time the page was modified? That information is carried with the document. And these are just a tip of the iceberg of all the different properties that are out there. But those things as well, we can view and manipulate so that we can write our applications. A method. Okay, so a method is what in other languages we might call functions. In fact, in JavaScript, we tend to have functions. But depending on the language that you switch to, like when you guys start learning Java, you have to do that in this program, you're going to discover that we call them methods. Kind of a horse apiece. So if you ever hear me say function in place of method or method in place of function, they're kind of one and the same. If you're learning VB, you get subroutines, you get functions, and it gets all confused, right? But really all those are in essence the same thing as well. They're just little blocks of code that we can manipulate. Some examples of a method will be something like this. So you see the last part of it where it says write with parentheses. That indicates that it's a function or a method. You have to call a function or a method and get it to work, you have to have the parentheses there. Sometimes you put stuff in there, sometimes you don't. But either way, you have to have it there to call it and make it work. In some cases, you guys are going to start to see a syntax that develops that looks like this, where you'll address an object hierarchy. So it could be document, body, paragraph, write line, or write, or whatever it is. So, and sometimes you just do a write if you're already in that correct position. So I don't want to get too much into the details of that and confuse the waters. But a method is something that happens and is usually a block of code that goes with it. All right, JavaScript also has the capability of interacting with the events that you perform on the screen. And that's where we start to see this thing called an event handler, and all programming languages have them. It's basically a way to interact with the user, whether it's touching the keyboard, moving the mouse, clicking, unclicking, double-clicking, click and drag. Oh, let's not forget touch screen now. Touch events too. Swipe, that pinch, zoom, twist, all those things. Those are all events. JavaScript is capable of reading those events and reacting to them. So you might, for example, set up something that goes on click, and you can see it's the first one here, trigger this function or method. So that's just very basic thing. And we'll learn more about these, so don't get too mired in the details of it right now. And then each one of the type of events that you would do has a different event handler name. These are not all the event handlers, just some of the more commonly used ones. All right, as I just said, you can configure JavaScript, write your code to execute based upon some sort of event. And the event might be when the page loads, trigger the script. That's what happened with our alert box. We didn't say that in our code, but it just automatically ran. In some cases, you don't want to put up the alert box until the user clicks a button or fills out a form or doesn't fill it out correctly. Now, if you want to try something fun, you could take this little snippet of code here and drop it onto the web page that we were just playing with. And I'm just going to paste this straight into the HTML. And I want you to see this very clearly. Here we're just writing regular HTML, and then we're setting an event handler. This is one that JavaScript recognizes. And when we mouse over the link that this creates, it's going to pop up an alert box. So please try that. All right, so let's just go ahead and run it. So you see the link, and then when you go over it, notice it doesn't go away though. You still have to click OK to make it disappear. But how cool is that? Now this is a very simplistic example, and usually when you learn JavaScript, those alert boxes are the very first thing you learn because it's instant satisfaction. It's like, wow, it did something. And then somebody will turn on the pop-up blocker and get rid of it all anyhow, right? Those types of pop-ups usually actually don't get blocked. It's the more obnoxious ones that get blocked. But that's just a very simple example of an event handler triggering JavaScript. So think of all the possibilities. All right, now the author gets into some real common sense things here. When you learn how to program, one of the things you often do is you learn about the debugging process, because rarely is your code perfect, right? Unless you're copying something verbatim out of a book, especially if you're writing your own, you have to have some sort of a strategy for fixing problems. Unfortunately, unless you're using a very high-end IDE, like Visual Studio, for example, will debug JavaScript. So that's actually a tool that you could use to write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if you have errors in your JavaScript code, Visual Studio will catch it, just like it would in a Visual Basic or C# program, and give you error messages and try to help you fix it. That's unusual, though. Not all programs offer that. Instead, they always push you to look at the browser to figure out what your errors are, and that's basically what we were just doing with Chrome. Now, the author points to Firefox as a tool you might want to use to do some of this stuff. You can do it in Chrome, you can do it in the new Edge browser. All the browsers have these tools. I will argue, though, and I try to convince people of this, that the best set of tools really are in Firefox, because Firefox has long been the developer's choice. It's only been the last 3, 4, or 5 years that people have latched onto Chrome. And Chrome is a wonderful tool, don't get me wrong, but if you play with the Inspect Element tool on Firefox compared to Chrome, it does have some advantages. There's some very cool little things that it does. But for the stuff that we're doing, any one of the browsers will work just fine. So don't favor one over the other just because the author says use it. Use whatever tool works for you. My encouragement would be try all of them, right? Why not? All right, we're getting at the point here where I think we need a break here in the classroom, and probably a good idea to start a fresh video. So that's what we're going to do. And we'll be back in 5 minutes or so. All right, we're going to continue in chapter 14 here, and we're going to learn a couple of new concepts. And as I said earlier, I always have the assumption that you guys have learned programming languages, and I put myself into the realization that this is a first semester course, and maybe you haven't really necessarily learned it, especially if you're not like full-time, right? Because you might not be taking a programming class yet. So we're going to learn about the concept of a variable, and you guys are going to kind of learn my take on what a variable is. And the analogy that I always like to use is I think of a variable as a box, okay? A box holds stuff, right? And usually if you give somebody a box, it's usually empty, right? And what can you put inside the box? Well, anything you want, right? So my analogy is basically that a box holds things, and then you can name it. You can name the box so that you know which box you're referring to, because you might have many boxes. And then in most programming languages, you also have to declare a data type for your variable, right? So if I want to put in an integer, counting numbers, I usually have to say int or integer, give it a name, and then put in a value. JavaScript, you don't need to do that. In fact, I want you guys to see this real carefully. I mean, they're being very formal here. They're going var, indicating it's a variable, and just declaring it. So they're just creating it. They created a box called username. There's nothing inside of it. Then they take username and they assign it a value. And whenever you see text or numbers inside of double quotes, we call that a string of characters. So they're placing a string inside the box that says Karen. Then we're using a little built-in function called write, and we are just going to write the username to the screen. That's what this little script does. But one thing I want to point out to you that's kind of interesting about JavaScript is I can actually skip this and just say username equals Karen, and it still works. There are scenarios, though, where you do want to use var, but for the most part, JavaScript is so flexible this way. Those that come from very rigid, formalized programming environments have a hard time sometimes latching onto the fact that it's so flexible. But it is that flexible. It automatically kind of adjusts. Now, if you wanted to play with this little piece of script, and I would encourage you to do it, you can take this and you can put it inside your script tags. Now, so far we put our alert up here. Usually if I was to do a document write, I would probably do that in the body of the document. Don't have to, but that's typically what I would do. All right, so in this case, we're still going to get our alert box. Then we're going to declare a variable called username. Username is going to be populated with a string Karen. And then we're going to issue this command that says document write. What are we writing? Karen. That's what should be written. So whatever is stored in the variable in the box, we are now going to write it to the screen. So I'm going to save, and I'm going to run it. Except it just came up in my other window, so I'm going to have to do that again. Let's try that again. Well, you can see that it worked, obviously. Okay, still going to my other window. Darn it. Here, you know what? I'll just do a refresh. All right. All right, you can't really tell when it does that, can you? All right, but maybe the smart thing to do is move the browser window over. So for some reason, it's going into my Google Hangouts window. Let's try that again. So much for the oohs and ahs, right? All right, and then it writes Karen to the screen. Now, this is kind of interesting because I can take this script, of course, and I can move it into the body section, right? Let's save it and compare the results now. Right, why? Because the document write happens after this stuff. Now here's something even more interesting. In fact, we should probably, I'm probably throwing too much at you guys all at once, right? Let's put it in a paragraph. I am throwing too much at you all at once, honestly. But it's so much fun, I can't contain myself. And I didn't mean to do that, sorry. And then we run into some other issues here, and that's mixing quotes. We'll talk about this stuff, but you can just copy what I'm doing for now. Because basically what happens is part of it's a string and part of it's not a string. But what I'm doing is I'm actually outputting HTML now. Don't worry about copying this example unless you're at home and can pause the video. And really I can just run it from here. Didn't work. Time to panic, right? Now we debug. Okay, so it says syntax error missing a closing parentheses on index line 20. Fortunately, I have a tool that allows me, right, to do what? Yeah. Actually, you know, I am pushing it too far because normally what you would do, and I have a variable name in the mix, so let's just strike the variable name for right now and just put in some text. Okay, so it put in the link, but really what's happening is if I was to actually insert a variable name, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you all at once. Then I also have to do a little concatenation. Yeah, plus signs for concatenation. Because this is a string, we're appending a different string to it, so it's got to be concatenated, and then it closes as a string. And we will, I'm not trying to throw too much at you guys all at once. I'm just showing you that you can kind of dynamically do stuff. So really what the capability that you have is to use JavaScript, and I want you to think about this real carefully, to help write your HTML for you. Now you'd be like, well, why don't I just write my own HTML? Thank you very much. Because you can actually do it programmatically. So you could set up an if statement where it says, if the user's been here before, you know, you can skip the welcome screen. If they haven't been here before, give them the welcome screen and get them to sign up for the newsletter and a monthly subscription or something like that. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea. So I'm going to expand this out so you can see the code there. Just a little something to try. All right, now we worked with an alert box before. This next little command that they're showing you is a thing called a prompt, which is very similar to an alert. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the alert. Actually, no, let's leave it in there. And you can see now I've got my name. What the heck is my name? It's a variable. Guess what? I didn't declare it. Right? But you know what? It's still going to work. In fact, what I could do is instead of doing a write of username, I could do a write of my name. And I'm just going to get rid of this stuff. And you know what? I will get rid of the alert. Goodbye, alert. So let's take this code, save your file, and run it. Something didn't work. So what do? Let's check the console. Invalid or unexpected token on line 17. Line 17. Oh, I see what it is. See that? Yeah, see the double quotes? How they're slanted? Instead of like this, instead of upright. That's from a copy paste. Those are smart quotes. They're not the same as double quotes. That happened because when I copy pasted, see the smart quotes? They curl down at the beginning and then curl up at the end. Careful where you copy paste from. And don't worry, I've been in situations where even though supposedly I know what I'm doing, I'll be looking at the screen for hours trying to figure out I can't get what's wrong. Oh, duh, smart quotes. All right, so let's try running this one. This is kind of fun. So you see what the prompt does? And then I click OK, and then it grabs it, and Chrome yells at you because of pop-ups. But see what it did though? It did the prompt, you typed in that little box, it stored it in a variable called my name, and then I did a write of my name and it put it back up on the screen. It's pretty nifty, right? Pretty simple to do. Also, you know, and I'm going to put in a couple of line breaks here so it doesn't always come after that link. A simple example of a prompt. All right, I know that we are going to be repeating some of these topics when we move into the new book. That's okay, because repetition makes perfection, or at least striving towards it. But as with most programming languages, JavaScript has certain things that it can do and certain language syntax that's applicable. like all programming languages, it can do math. And these are the mathematical operators that you use to do math. And these should all be familiar to you. These are pretty common. Okay, use these to do math. The other thing, when you're doing math, it does math. If you're adding strings together, it concatenates. Interesting, right? Don't worry about that for right now. We will clarify as we go. The other thing that you often do, especially if you're doing decision statements, which you can see is coming up next, is you have what they call logical operators where you can compare things. So in other words, in some cases you might say, if my name equals Joe, then output this. Otherwise, output something else. And these are the operators that we use to check for statements of truth, basically, to test logic. So check to see if something is equivalent. Notice that's different than an equal sign. If we were to do math in JavaScript, and please keep in mind that we are going to revisit all this stuff, I might do something like 1 plus 2, right? And then I might document write the variable I just created. A standard equal sign is what we call an assignment statement. So the variable name will always be on the left, and it will always receive the value that's being generated on the right. It could be hard-coded, it could be math, it could be the result of a function. So that's a pretty important concept, especially if you're new to programming. Variable names on the left. A single equal sign means that it's going to accept the value of whatever's on the right. Excuse me. By comparison, though, when we're looking for comparison or a logical evaluator, a double equal sign is checking to see if things are equivalent. It is not assigning a value. So for example, I might say, is 5 equal 6? No. It resolves to true or false. You see the difference? Okay. Now, there's also some of these here that you're probably familiar with: less than, greater than or equal to, those kind of statements. And where we apply those things are in these decision statements we're about to see next. But one that you should be aware of is if you're saying not equal, it's exclamation equal, and that's true for most programming languages. The one that's the oddball again is VB, where it's like less than, greater than put together. Oh my God, who thought of that? That's not good. So that's the only language I know of that does it that way. All right, so where would you use these operators? In these condition statements like this. So this is considered a decision statement using the keyword if and else. So if some condition is true, then you execute a statement, otherwise you do something else. Once again, we'll formally look at this in the other book. This is just a quick overview. Now, another thing that you can do is you can develop a block of code. In other words, you can develop a series of statements that are inside a set of curly braces. Those curly braces kind of tell you where you're starting and you're ending your block of code. And if you precede those curly braces with the keyword function and give it a name, and notice once again the parentheses, that series of statements can all be executed in one fell swoop by just calling the name of the function. So I could write a set of statements that's like, get a value, do some math, check to see if it's true, do this or that, do some more math, concatenate a string, output some HTML, and you're done. And if I give it all one name, in my main block of code, I can just say, do whatever that is. It just does it. You just call it by name and it executes all those lines of code. That's how a function works.
Is it in a separate file?
No,
It's on the same page?
it's in the same script file, yes. Now, he goes into a little bit more here about that. So he's just showing an example, a very simplistic one, where you would create the function called show alert, and then to get it to run, you just use its name. But typically when you have a function, there's multiple statements. Something else is happening that's a little bit more complex, and it allows you in the main body of your code to kind of skip all the details and just call the whole thing in one fell swoop. It's just an efficiency, basically. One real popular use for JavaScript is to validate form information. Now, you guys remember when we were working on forms? And one of the little things that you could add was required, remember that? Or if you set it to type email, it would kind of automatically check to see if it's email format. Prior to HTML5, the only way to accomplish that was by using either a scripting language or a programming language. So we would write JavaScript that would check it for us in the background. So for example, if I wanted to see if the username was left blank, I would say if document form 0 username dot value equals an empty string, then we'll throw up an alert box that says name field cannot be empty. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an alert box, but that's just what they're using here as an example. And that was a rudimentary form of validation. And when you learn JavaScript, that's usually one of the things you learn how to do. Now, HTML5 kind of saves us from a little bit of that, so it's kind of like a godsend in a way, because it saves you from having to write code like this. But there's some things that you really can't do with HTML5 still. Like if you have a real complex set of conditions that you're looking for, it's really best handled with JavaScript. And sometimes you'll have multiple layers of validation. You might use HTML5 and JavaScript and a server-side programming language, and the database you're feeding it to might also do its own validation. And the whole point is so you don't corrupt the database, or you don't corrupt the data going into the database. I would say that all those levels are probably irrelevant and unnecessary, but JavaScript is one of the key ways that people do validate forms, and in some ways is significantly more robust than the HTML5 approach. Although I'm going to guess that they're going to keep ramping up that capability in HTML5, so we'll see how the future goes with that. Now, there is the capability, and I don't know if you guys are aware of this, in all browsers, in Chrome and Firefox and Edge all have this capability. You can actually go into your settings and actually turn off JavaScript. It's been so long since I've done it, I always forget where it is. So somewhere in here it says run JavaScript, wherever that is. If somebody sees it, point it out to me, please. All right, so apparently it's under this privacy section, content settings, and under JavaScript it says allow sites to run JavaScript recommended. And really, in the past a lot of people would turn it off because they were afraid that the scripts could do something malicious to their system. All they can do malicious to your system is trick you to do something malicious. But you can do that with a regular web page too. It was like not an unusual thing to put up a pop-up that looked like a virus warning, that kind of thing. But really, it's just a pop-up that looks like a virus warning. It's not actually a virus. So, but that's a setting that some people, for some circumstances, will actually click to off, and then you got a problem because you write this JavaScript to make your page do all this stuff, and then the stuff doesn't work, right? And so if you think in terms of your email, like Gmail or something like that, that uses JavaScript heavily, you're not going anywhere. You're not doing any email, that's for sure, if your JavaScript's not turned on. So that is something you should generally leave turned on. So, okay, the point of that is that you can do some little coding tricks to kind of allow for working around that problem just in case it happens. One typical way to do that is they actually have a tag called, guess what, no script. And you know what you put inside there? The message that shows when the scripts are turned off. Now, generally speaking, in the past, like those comment marks, we always put them in, and we always put in no script because we really couldn't predict what was going to happen. But now, I would say that that's actually functionally useless as well. But if anything, you could put in a little message that says turn on JavaScript. And maybe once in a while you say, JavaScript is not enabled in your browser. Please turn it on if you actually want to use our website. Otherwise, go somewhere else and get the error message from them. All right. All right. Now we're going to move forward a little bit and learn about a real important JavaScript library. jQuery is a JavaScript library that offers a big collection of pre-written functions, basically, that allow you to execute certain types of tasks and activities with much less code and gives you some capabilities that you would not otherwise have. So, for example, one thing that you can do with jQuery is instead of writing maybe about 10 lines of JavaScript in order to make like an object move across the screen, you can just write one little line of jQuery that does the same thing. But really what's happening, because it's a library, is you're calling a command in the library that's writing those 10 lines of code. It's just, and that's what kind of like a library does. Now, why jQuery? jQuery is the most popular one. jQuery actually does have its own website, and you can actually download the libraries if you want. But it was very commonly used in the pre-HTML5 days to accomplish certain effects that were not possible prior to HTML5. And one of the big proponents and users and developers of it was Google, and still is. They don't own it, it's an open source thing, but that's a lot of what makes a lot of the stuff that's cool on their websites cool. In fact, if you want to see an example of all the jQuery that they use, you just go to Google. Oh, this is technically a Google page too. And just take a look at the source. And I'm just trying to see if there's, right? Yeah, this is very hard to read through. You guys got that? It's good. This is going to be on the final. All right, let's not look at it that way. Here, I know a really good way to learn a little bit about jQuery. If you go to your browser and just go to W3, and I should have done this with JavaScript also, but they have an excellent section on JavaScript and with tutorials, and they have these little try it now tools. So all I did is I went to the JavaScript page, and then they have, in many places in their site, they have these little try it yourselves. And if you go there, you'll see that they have like the code on the left and the output on the right. So it says click me to display the date and time, and you see it does it, and the code for doing it is right here. This is a great place to learn some of this stuff. But what's neat is if you want to see some of the things that jQuery does, let's go back a page here, and you can see that they have a Learn jQuery section, and let's just look at this real simple example that they have here. So they have a little bit of code here that basically says that when you click a paragraph, it hides it. So guess what? We got 3 paragraphs. Well, I can't bring them back, but it made them disappear. But in order to do that with JavaScript, it takes a whole lot more code. But that's just an example of the kind of thing that jQuery does. It has its own special syntax that obviously you would need to learn. And those of you that are in the web program, we do, after this course, we do the dynamic elements course, which is the basic JavaScript, and then you do the graphics programming with dynamic elements. That's the jQuery class. That's a 3-credit class. And if I remember right, the first one is offered in the spring and the second one's offered in the summer. And the second one, if you miss it in the summer, you have to wait a whole another year before it comes around again. So don't miss it in the summer, which means take the other one in the spring. Got that? SharePoint people, you don't have to worry about that because you get your hefty dose of JavaScript and Web 2. So just a little bit of a clue. So that's kind of some of the things that jQuery can do. If you are going to add jQuery, you can actually go ahead and download the library and add it to the folder structure of your site, and then link to it like you do with CSS or what you'll learn to do with JavaScript, just linking to external files. The other choice is to connect to an online repository, and a popular one to attach to are the Google jQuery libraries. And there's many different versions. Like here they're showing a real old library. I think jQuery is up to like version 3 something, maybe even beyond that at this point. But that's a couple different ways to pull it in. So you don't even have to have the files in your folder structure. You can just point to somewhere else and the jQuery will run. So that's just helpful to know. The way that you leverage jQuery is you use what they call the document ready function that basically says, as soon as the document loads, do this jQuery or do this JavaScript. And the thing that you should notice here is it says your JavaScript statements and other jQuery statements go here. You can intersperse, you can do a jQuery statement, you can do JavaScript, and you can do some more jQuery. You can intermingle them and they work just fine together because they're all JavaScript. If the regular JavaScript engine doesn't understand it, it goes to the jQuery library and finds it. The thing that's also kind of interesting about these JavaScript libraries is jQuery is not the only one. It's one of many. It just happens to be by far the most popular one, and it's very heavily used in web development. Very, very heavily used. All right, so notice here the document ready function kind of does what we already did, but what this does is it says as soon as the document is loaded and ready, trigger this function. What's the function? The alert. Okay, that's just one of the typical uses. jQuery, one of the things that makes it really easy to use is the fact that it uses CSS style selectors. What that means is you'll always see a $sign at the beginning and a set of parentheses, and the jQuery code will always affect what's inside those parentheses, just as it would in CSS. So if I put in $my ID, it's attaching itself to some HTML element that's got an ID of my ID. If it's .myClass, it's a class. If it's just like an LI or a paragraph or a H1, it just says exactly that. So that is a very simple way of attaching JavaScript or jQuery to a particular object on the page. Much simpler than it is doing regular JavaScript. With regular JavaScript, you end up writing this like long statement to do the same thing. And that's one of the things that originally triggered jQuery. It's like, do I really have to write all that? You know, why can't I just use the same thing I use for CSS? So it was, you know, in a sense, it was kind of brilliant. All right, some examples of common things you can do. You can apply various methods. Some of them are related directly to events. Some of them are not. And you can just get a real brief example of what some of these things do. Just as a brief example, in this case, they look for anchor tags. And when you click the anchor tag, it triggers this, which basically finds a list item with a pseudo selector of even, so every other list item, and sets the CSS for color to this color. You can do that with jQuery too. But only when the person clicks on the anchor tag. Isn't that interesting? So, I mean, you can do like all sorts of crazy stuff. So in this case, you click, and then these two turn green. That's pretty cool, right? I'm not really worried too much about teaching you guys this stuff in detail right now, because you're going to learn about this in a whole separate course. SharePoint, you'll learn it in Web 2. Web, you have one whole course dedicated to working with jQuery, because it is that important. And then they have an example here, and this is one that's kind of interesting, right? You know the one where we just clicked on W3 and it made something disappear? I had written a web page, many years ago for an event. And long story short is I needed to write something so that when people purchased a ticket for the event, if they were a student, they'd get one price, and if they were a regular person, they'd get a different price. So I was able to have them click to show the price for student, but then what if they click back? I couldn't get the thing to disappear, you know? And then I discovered, oh, there's show and there's hide, but what if I just needed to flip back and forth, and it's called toggle? And back then, I don't know if I was just a bad Googler, but I didn't figure it out right away. I figured it out sometime afterward. But it allows you to turn things on and off, and that's what they're showing here. Another thing that people very often do with jQuery and with JavaScript is they create things like image galleries. So you guys go to like websites, and at the top of the page, things like rotate and move, and you get the little left-right arrows and little dots at the bottom. Those things are done using scripting technologies, usually JavaScript and or jQuery working in tandem with each other. In this case here, this should look kind of familiar, that image gallery that you guys were working on in one of your chapters. Blank stares. Okay, we'll be working on soon. And just shows you a little bit of code that you can add to have it basically pop these things up. So in chapter 14, they give you the code for it. You can play with it a little bit. It's not all that difficult to do. Now, jQuery, like other languages, has tools that you can pull in. So a library that can pull in other libraries. You picking up on the complexity there? So it has basically the ability to add other functionality to it. And now you guys are really traversing the rabbit hole, right? I just want to do my paragraph tags and my web page to look nice. But you know, as you progress in web development, this is the kind of path that you follow. Don't get overwhelmed with the complexity. Things will come in due time. Okay, this is just an introduction. And really, this is the conclusion of the chapter, some of the things that we learned. And hopefully you'll see like the importance of this as we move forward. So that ends this video and our discussion on chapter 14. And we're going to use some time here in class to do some work and then proceed from there.